So we've been asked to all talk about changing broadcast landscapes. I started in TV about 24 years ago, and I was in news for a long time. I started out for a company called Financial Times Television, which made very bad business news for what is now CNBC, but if you look at it now, it looks like it was something made in the 1960s. And then moved to Channel 5 News when that launched, and worked on the much unwatched breakfast show that they had called 5 News and Sport, which was a show which at the time when Channel 5 launched and only penetrated to about 60-70% of the country, started at 6 a.m. and ended at 7:30. So basically it was finished before most people had woken up. And then worked at Sky News, briefly overlapping with Ronan for quite a long time, and then went to Al Jazeera English and helped set that up. And then now I'm on the Wright Stuff, and I've been on the Wright Stuff for 9.5 years. And so in that time, quite lots changed. And certainly, one thing I would say about the Wright Stuff is, the Wright Stuff is a show which works on opinions, but was launched in the year 2000 on September the 11th. Not the most auspicious date, perhaps, certainly for its first birthday. But it was launched then as a show to give opinions. And the reason why it was launched was because Channel 5 were pitching for a new kind of daytime show. And Channel 5 obviously has smaller budgets and other things, so it couldn't compete with what was out there, and was looking for something a bit different and something that allowed people to give their opinions. And 17 years later, that's still what the key point of the show is to give people opinions. And the way people give their opinions has changed enormously. But actually, in terms of what the show is, that's not changed terribly much. If you ask Matthew Wright how he came up with the idea for the show, he claims that he did, and who am I to question that? It was based on Frasier, the sitcom, which is why you'll notice if you watch the Right Stuff, there is someone who sits there and says, "Hello, on line 3, you have so-and-so," because that was supposed to be the Roz character. Because initially when it was based in Norfolk, and the guests were not of the highest quality, because not that many exciting celebrities spend much time in Norfolk, which is why they moved it to London after a year. But at the end of the day, the show is always about people's opinions. And that's really what the people's opinions are what make the show and do it now. The opinions haven't really changed. The number of opinions, where they come from, and where the people who give their opinions get their information has changed extraordinarily. And the Right Stuff's quite lucky in one way. We're a bit like the news. Our show can evolve every day just by the nature of what is happening somewhere in the world that we think people are interested in and want to talk about. The stories that can be discussed and will be discussed at breakfast tables, dinner tables, at water coolers, anywhere. So we're constantly evolving in terms of the content that we have, even though we have to cover similar stories on, that we've done a million times. And we know that we could fill the show every day and people would still call in if literally we just did bring back hanging every day. But we'd like to think that we have a few things that are slightly more interesting than that. And we're also quite lucky, I suppose, in one sense, in that the Right Stuff does still sit somewhere between what Ronan does in the news and what Martin does this morning. We can cover quite easily debates about Grenfell Tower and the election in a way that would be slightly perhaps, or not, not that this morning doesn't do it and do it very well, but they do it in a slightly different way. But we can also do things like we did this morning, where we had quite a lengthy debate on whether you should punish a child for scratching "I love you, Daddy" into his car. So it's different things, and some things have changed enormously. I would say we'll talk more about social media and how that's really changed the way that we get information to people and get information from people. But some things really don't. One thing that I always find extraordinary is that in an age where we're being told constantly that no one reads newspapers, no one cares about newspapers anymore, the newspaper review, which is about half an hour between 10 and 10:30 every morning on the Right Stuff, is every day the most watched part of our programme. And tinker with that part of the programme at your peril, because as soon as we cut it down, if we cut it down by 5 minutes, people call in and complain. And it's interesting to know that people who don't watch or don't like news, 24-hour news, sorry Ronan, there are people out there like that, feel informed. It's the one way that's where they get their news. And these are probably people, and we'll talk a bit more about daytime audiences because they are quite different, certainly in terms of who the people are watching and what actually how PRable they can be. They don't listen to the radio necessarily, or they listen to music stations that they don't really pay much attention to the news part of it, and they won't watch BBC Breakfast, and they won't watch Sky News, and they won't watch BBC News. They will watch the right stuff, because that half an hour will make them feel like they know what's going on and what's happening in the world. But another thing, so that sort of hasn't changed. But one thing, where we find our stories has changed completely. We look online. We have a much wider ability to find tales from around the internet. The competition has increased enormously. There's still traditional competition. The Right Stuff has a very obvious competitor in the Victoria Derbyshire show on BBC Two, which is a really aggressive move by the BBC, deliberately targeted at the kind of audience that were watching the Right Stuff. Obviously, they want to take it much larger than that, but it has the weight of the BBC behind it and does the things that we just can't, we can't do on a much smaller budget for a much smaller channel. And of course, there's This Morning. I'm sure it's not a surprise that we look at, where the breaks, when does This Morning start? Can we make sure that our break patterns our break doesn't hit that moment where people might be switching over after Jeremy Kyle or something else. And that has increased, that's the kind of basic competition that's there and we know is there. There's also the competition from, an increasing number of niche channels. ITV3 does bizarrely well at that time in the morning. But also from people who are not necessarily interested in watching what they're offered by the main 5 channels. There are now hundreds of channels out there, and that's before you talk about people who are watching catch-up, Netflix, YouTube, and whatever. And there's a sort of a non-traditional competition, which is more that for a debate show like The Right Stuff, a lot of what we do is the very nature of social media, which is putting an argument out there and debating one side or the other. If you go on Facebook and look at the comments behind any particular, or Twitter, particularly Facebook, you go and look at the comments that list below that, they are essentially what could be seen as a Right Stuff debate in miniature. So we need to look at, and we have looked at, how is it that we use social media and what are the issues that social media, the rise of social media, which is often a debating and news gathering and news giving tool to improve what we do. For us, Facebook and Twitter are the key things. We don't have we don't have a social media, we don't have someone whose job it is to deal with social media. It's part of what is quite a small team's job to deal with everything. And Facebook and Twitter are the key ones because those are the large debating platforms. Instagram is less of something for us, although we are trying to do it because it's not a terribly visual show. Those of you who've seen The Right Stuff will probably know. And then there were kind of things that we looked beyond those to things like FaceTime was something that we wanted to use. We've been trying to get the obvious thing to do because we invite people to call in, email in, text in, tweet in, etc. We want to get their faces on screen, but weirdly that is something that's actually quite tricky to do, largely because Skype in this country, despite the fact in America, seems to work beautifully. And if you watch old episodes of Oprah from about 10 years ago, you'll see that they were Skyping each other, and it looked like proper a real live broadcast. If you try it in the UK, inevitably it will drop out at the very moment the person's got to the point that they want to. And also, actually, weirdly, we're having a long battle with our legal team at Channel 5 about the legalities of asking people to actually show their faces and homes on screen in a way that, when you're calling in, you don't have. But social media is very useful for us. As a current affairs show, we need to know what people are talking about and what is interesting to our audience, and trending topics can help with that, and just our own social media posts to put out there to see what people, what gets a good reaction and what doesn't. But I think we also need to be, one of the key things we do need to be aware of is the kind of people who are tweeting or commenting on Facebook and what that is saying about, the country and about how how our program works. And something I've noticed recently is that it seems people's views have become far more entrenched. Whichever way they're politically engaged or whatever. Social media allows people to follow only the people that they are interested in the views of. And I think that can, it was particularly interesting around the election, I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, that your social feeds become swamped with what you're interested in. And you often don't tend to look much beyond that. So, for example, if you are a Labour supporter, you will have a lot of Labour supporting things and Labour supporting celebrities and those sorts of things around in your feed. If you're a Tory supporter, similarly. And I think that has actually allowed people to, in a way, while they have access to more arguments than ever, actually to ignore a large proportion of them. And I think that we need to think about. I mean, if you look at the election, I've got some useful, interesting stats that I've discovered. You know, whichever way you look at it, really, you know, Labour didn't win the election in terms of they didn't get more seats than any other party. Neither did the Tories, but they certainly didn't win. But they did on social media. They were putting out 30 to 40 posts every day in the run-up to the election, compared to the Conservatives about 10. And when they did put something out, they were getting about 80 to 100,000 interactions with every post that they were getting, compared to about 30 to 40 for the Tories. And actually for the other parties, it's far lower. And now that might be that twice as many of the population actually thought the Labour Party had better policies than everyone else. I think the results of the election might question that. But it might just mean that people who are using social media are inherently more left-wing, or that Labour were doing it better, and that the stuff that was out there was more interesting. And I think that can be an issue when you're looking at social media as a basis for a television programme, certainly a debate programme. You know, it's changed the way we research things. We look at all, you know, that's where we get our initial response from people, is on social media. Before anything goes on screen, we've put we've put the debates that we're having that day on social media, and we're getting responses. And I think in a world that's as tightly regulated as TV, it's interesting to think how we, and I think something we all have to think about, is how you take information from an entirely unregulated world and translate it into something which is incredibly highly regulated, like British TV. And that's actually one of the other big things that I've noticed that's changed in the 25 years I've been working in TV is regulation and the ability of people to realize how to complain. And I think, I know my theory of this, and I've talked to various people about it, and I'm not sure everyone actually quite agrees, it was that if you remember the Jonathan Ross and Russell Brand issue from several years ago, I know that was on the BBC, and the BBC weren't at that point regulated by Ofcom, but that story, suddenly a lot of people realised there was this thing called Ofcom, that if they didn't like something that was on television, they could write to that, and they could write to them, and they would get some kind of response. And I think they've also started to realise that, you know, as I'm sure Martin may well tell you, you know, if you write an angry email to the Wright stuff and put, I'm going to take this to the authorities, regardless of how pointless that complaint actually is, we have to take that seriously, because otherwise we will get we are in danger, or may well get a letter from Ofcom telling us, can you please go through it, which takes hours of our time, kind of going back through transcripts and writing stuff up and writing thank you, apologetic notes and those sorts of things. And it takes forever, and people are more likely to do that, and are doing it more often than they ever have. And I think that, you know, the other half of my job is as the head of branded content at Princess, which is in a completely different world, but also very regulated as to what you're allowed to see and not to see. And that's an interesting thing for people who work in public relations, is, you know, how do you get your brand on screen? You know, we need to think about how we do that. And actually what's interesting is that intelligent brands will know that putting their brand front and center all the time on something is probably not the best way to sell it to people. Although there is a really interesting study that I would suggest you dig out if you're interested in it, this kind of thing, by a guy called Alex Connock, who works with me, who works the head of Shine North. And he did a survey for Reuters about branded content and how you put, which is another whole new area of change in TV, but how much people actually care about the fact that something's been paid for by a brand. And for that, he went to the Sheffield Documentary Festival and asked a load of documentary makers, would you make a documentary about surfing if it was paid for by BP? And this was a couple of years after the Gulf of Mexico BP disaster. And almost all the documentaries said, no, of course we wouldn't. He then went to a sample groups in America, the UK, and in Hong Kong to ask them, would you watch a documentary that was made about surfing by BP? And just on that, I think 98% of people asked said, yeah, they wouldn't mind watching that. And then he said, okay, fine. Now it's not just being paid for by BP, but BP also wrote the script. And even when you say something can't get as far as that, actually it only drops down to about, well, in Hong Kong it dropped down to about 90%. In the US, about 75, and in the UK, about 65 or 70. So actually, there are those kind of, there are different ways of looking at how branding and those sorts of things and complaints can fit in to the way we watch TV and the way we consume TV. I think to a degree, sometimes you feel that Ofcom has a slightly low opinion of how intelligent the audience is. And that's a problem. That's a problem sometimes, particularly when you have someone presenting your program like Matthew. He's an opinionated man, as any of you who've ever watched the show will probably know. And he has an opinionated Twitter feed, but his Twitter feed is not the Right Stuff Twitter feed. And it is made very clear on our Twitter feed that we are not connected with him, and on his, that he's not, these are his views and his personal views and not the views of the Right Stuff or Channel 5. And yet, we get complaints all the time about things that he's tweeted about and then those sorts of things. And it's a question of moving forwards. When there are so many places for a presenter to put their private opinions forward, is a presenter allowed to have private opinions? I don't know if anyone's seen this story today that Jon Snow from Channel 4 News was at Glastonbury at the weekend and is reliably, or someone has tweeted to say, had a great day dancing with Jon Snow, couldn't imagine him saying fuck the Tories as he did, which is, he is denying, and it may well not be true, but nevertheless that is something that is now out there, that is on Twitter, people know it, and it will sit there forever. And Matthew is key to our show, and one thing that hasn't evolved in the 17 years it's been on air is him. He's been there, his name's right there in the title. We have some great stand-ins. Matt Barbette, Richard Madeley, Penny Smith have all done it in the last few months, but the ratings always suffer slightly when Matthew's not there. He's a person people want to argue with, though we get a very different reaction on things from all of them. We get daily complaints about each, as well as daily praise. And it's interesting to note that we'll get the same people emailing, tweeting every day to say how much they hate Matthew and how can we possibly get him on air. And it's like, well, you're talking about something that happened 3/4 of the way through the show. You're clearly watching, and you clearly watched yesterday, and you clearly watched the day before and the day before that. So, but make a mistake, and it's out there forever. We're always looking. Anyone in TV is looking for that moment that you can now put online, and the one you used to keep for the kind of Christmas tape or the end of the year best of bits that now go straight out online, and you want to go viral, and people around the world will be talking about your show. But similarly, you make a mistake, and someone's been recording it, and it's out there, and there's nothing you can do about it. I've yet to find a TV show that's gone to Google to ask for their past to be erased. So it's something that we do need to think about. The things that you will give and you get bitten back as well. Another thing that's changed is social media and the internet has changed the way research works. Our panel, things that we can find out about people online and about their views is far easier. If we need answers from someone, if we need to contact someone, it's often easier to contact them via their Twitter or Facebook page than it is to desperately dig around trying to find a number. But again, that's an issue we need to address when researching. Just because there is that information out there and that someone has a comment out there, doesn't necessarily mean it's correct. We need to treat social media like we treat any other source and actually investigate it slightly more than I think people tend to do, particularly when you're in a busy newsroom or busy kind of any kind of busy situation where it's sort of social media can give you a lot of content quite quickly. It can tell you, you can get all kinds of different people's views and different things, but it's sort of we need to have the usual checks and balances you would have on that in any other way. And we need to be careful. We need to check that when you're chasing that viral video, are you chasing a viral video because actually because you think that piece of content actually has genuine value, or are you leaving it there just because you know that 150 million people might watch it? And that's something to look at, particularly about daytime audiences, which is something that we need to think about on The Right Stuff, and Martin obviously on This Morning. They tend to be very loyal, they tend to be slightly older, they tend to be slightly more female focused, probably, if we're honest, slightly more CTDE, because people who are ABC ones tend to have jobs and tend to go out and do them, and that's something that we need to think about, and the way that they use social media may be different from the way other people use social media. 16 million British people have a Twitter account, but surveys have shown that the stats show that it's a relatively small number of highly active users that dominate. So you can feel by going on Twitter, oh yes, this is how the country feels, but actually it's actually giving you a very skewed view of how that works. And one of the other problems with social media is, and it's a personal thing, is it's really staff heavy. It takes a lot of time to keep across both our own social media feeds and the social media feeds of the people we need to know what they're doing. TWS, actually, The Right Stuff has fewer people working on it now than it did 9.5 years ago when I started. And I think, to talk about sort of PR, that's kind of what you will do. That does mean that the way that you perhaps deal with us has to change as well. I'm sure none of you in this room would ever do this, but it's surprising the number of people that we get that contact me with things that, if they'd ever watched even one episode of the show, knows that's not what we do. It may well be what another show at the same time is doing, but it's not what we do. And I think, and generic press releases not really likely to get much traction now. You've got to understand, as we talked about regulation, that there are things that TV shows can't do. And and a number of PR people have certainly told me, well, they did it on such and such a show, and it's like, well, they didn't, because if they did, we would know about it, because Ofcom would have ruled against them for doing such a thing. And it's worth doing those, looking at how that can change, and probably actually looking more at sort of simpler and more direct, targeted stuff. I think probably no one in TV is ever going to complain that a PR person has got, or a PR agent has got in touch with them to give them something which they've actually thought about. I mean, I'm not suggesting you spend hours and hours doing it, but have spent some time at least thinking, what is it that show does, and how does this fit with that show, rather than what is obviously, we've got this thing that we need to get out to as many people as possible, and we'll give it a punt at the right stuff just because that's a show that's on and it's 2 hours long, and they probably have a small amount of staff and lots of airtime to fill, so they might go for it. So those are kind of some of the things that have certainly changed and need to change. One of the big things that's happening with the Wright stuff is that, some of you may know, it's been put out to tender by Channel 5. So from January next year, it may be a whole different ball game. But I'm hoping that it will keep that thing, because I think there's a role there for people's opinions at that time in the morning, and done in a way that isn't done anywhere else on TV. So those are some of my thoughts. I'm sure there'll be questions later, and I will pass over now to Ronan.
Tim picked up on quite a lot of things which cross over with news, talking about social media and the pitfalls and the perks of it, talking about regulation. But I'll talk to you about news and the way that news has changed, particularly in the time that I've been there. And I've been at Sky News for the last 11 years. Before that I was at ITN and worked at a few other news channels, Channel 5 News. Worked on a production company breakfast program called Rise, if anybody remembers that. And worked at Sky News prior to that as well. But in the last 11 years that I've been at Sky News, I've worked on pretty much every different type of program that there is. I've worked on the evening Live at 5, Appointment to View, I suppose the equivalent of BBC News at 6. I've worked on the News at 10, I've worked on daytime output, and for the last 6 years I have worked on Sunrise, and I'm responsible for the output from midnight until midday effectively, although I'm not obviously there all that time. And in that time I've noticed quite a big shift in the type of news that we do and how we do it, and how Sky News has grown up, and how it's had to grow up, and how it's had to be much less show busy and much more serious. And I hope that's the sort of product that you all enjoy today. But why don't I ask you a question really about what you think Sky is, and interested to get a kind of show of hands from you about how many of you think that the kind of be-all and end-all of Sky News is breaking news? Anybody? Yeah? Yeah. That's interesting. Nobody seems to think that be-all, end-all is breaking news. What about original, world-class, distinctive journalism? Does that feel like something that Sky News is? Yeah? Good. And final question really is about, what is Sky News? Is Sky News a TV channel, or is it much more important that it's on mobile and TV now? So how many people think it's a TV channel? Okay, so an interesting kind of spread there, because Sky News really has to try and be all of those things, but it's important that we try and address, and have done the last couple of years, some of the disparities on that, and particularly how we've gone from being a 24-hour rolling TV news channel which focuses on breaking news and was quite unashamedly about that, to now putting much more investment into specialist journalism, which I'll come on to in a minute. But I'll sort of hark back to kind of whenever I started at Sky News, and the reality back then, as I say, was that we were about breaking news. That was a kind of brief. It was fast, it was bold, it was relentless in the way that we would attack any developing story, and often it was any developing story. There was no Twitter back then. There was nobody to sort of compete with and try and get the story out there before us, except for the BBC, and ITN had a news channel back then. And in the gallery, it was all about trying to get the strap on before the BBC, and Tim will know this as well. In a way, that kind of sense remains the same, but actually there's more to it now than that. And I'll give you an example. I was in the gallery when Gordon Brown resigned as Prime Minister, and we'd already broken that we knew he was going to resign. Our sources had told us, we had it on screen, we're up at a live shot of Downing Street, waiting for him to walk out. Sky sources, Gordon Brown to resign. The story's already done. But when he walked out and stood there and stood in front of his lectern, and the moment he said, "I will step aside," or whatever it was that he said then, it was all about getting the strap on before the BBC had the strap on. And that was the big fight was about then. It was about being first on all those stories. But of course, the reality is that, being first for breaking news, which was the Sky kind of motto, it's a bit naive now, because actually to be the first for breaking news permanently is really bloody hard, because on Twitter you've got everybody and their mother all breaking stories. Quite often there will be some god-awful event which will happen, as we've seen in the last month, and really the first we will hear about it will be, "Oh, have you seen that on Twitter?" And we need to react and address that. But it's changed the way that we think about what we produce and what we are. And in a way, if there was a Gordon Brown moment again tomorrow, or there have been plenty of moments recently, getting the strap on for breaking news, as we do, actually much more important now is the push notification, because actually most people, whenever an event happens, will first hear about it because their phone will beep. And that's how we're having to change the way that we staff things. We've appointed recently a notifications editor. That would have been something nobody even heard of before, and his job is really to try and focus the attention so as we're connecting with our audience in the best way when these things happen. And if you take an example like the Westminster terror attack, which happened at 2:00 in the afternoon, I wonder how many of you first knew about that, not because there was a TV screen on your office, which is traditionally how it would have happened, and you probably found out half an hour or hour and a half later when you've got somebody who said, "Oh, do you see that thing that's on Sky News?" Actually now, you've probably got something which has gone beep on your phone. You're like, "Oh my God." And then you turn Sky News on, or you turn the BBC on, or you go on to a live blog on The Guardian or The Telegraph, or, God forbid, the Mail Online. But that has changed the way that we deal with breaking news in the past couple of years particularly, and that will continue to evolve. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that, in 5 years' time we're all going to be getting news on our watches or stupid goggles or whatever, because I don't know. But what we have to do is address the here and now and recognise that actually the way people are consuming news is changing quickly. Another big kind of component of what I've done at Sky News over the last kind of 11 years has been really built around pictures. And pictures really are the sort of the cornerstone of our coverage. TV, mobile, it's all about, a picture can tell you so much more than words ever can. And I was exec producer on the night of the London riots back in 2011, and I thought that was a story which really encapsulated pictures very, very well. The main kind of evening of disruption, violence, happened on a Sunday evening. So it was very quiet, and we got the Sky Chopper up, which was giving us some fantastic images. But actually, the most compelling images from that evening were obtained by one of our reporters who lived in Clapham and went down onto Clapham High Street with his mobile phone and filmed a load of guys outside just smashing up shops. And there's a very engaging moment. If you look up Mark Stone London riots, you'll see the clip where he kind of fronts up one of the rioters and says, you know, what are you doing? And it was a very engaging moment, which actually, because it was in the heat of the moment, told you so much more about that story than you know, a journalist with a proper camera could at that time. And there is a role for both of those. And when we are thinking about how we cover stories now and in the future, you know, we have to consider, you know, what is the best way for us to film that? Is it somebody who's got, you know, a camera on their shoulder, which is, you know, excellent resolution and gives them lots of options, or do you send somebody in with a backpack and, you know, a simple little phone, which we do as well. And the other side of talking about pictures, which has changed, is the fact that, you know, we get a lot of pictures from you now. You know, whenever there's a story which develops, often in a different part of the country where we don't have cameras and can't get cameras to, and you know, it's about chasing down those pictures. And we have people in Sky News now who are really experts in obtaining those images, chasing down on social media, and equally, just importantly, is verifying them. And that's the other side of it, and that's a big challenge for all newsrooms, is ensuring that whenever we see that amazing piece of picture, that it's definitely true. And things like floods, whenever there's floods, or you know, if there's a hurricane somewhere, or whatever, those are really difficult ones to sometimes isolate, because actually a blowy street looks like a blowy street. And the other thing which has changed a great deal in the time that I've been there again, and will continue to change, is technology and innovation. And again, this is a key thing of what we've done. And in the past, before I started at Sky News, I worked at ITN, and I was there when they launched. I don't know if anyone's ever been into ITV News, but they've got a massive big green screen, which is where they film their news off. I helped launch that. And then it was all about how we could use that to make high impact storytelling treatments, how we use graphics. And you would do things like, flying in Chinooks and big fighter jets to try and explain what's going on in Iraq at the time or anywhere else. And Sky News did the exact same. There'd be instances where you would have a story and you would literally fill the whole newsroom with these graphic stuff. But you won't really see that now, because it's a bit crass. Again, it's about how we've sort of grown up. But that technology and how we tell those stories is still there, and innovation is key. And Alex Crawford, our special correspondent, was the only journalist in the world to report on the fall of Tripoli a few years ago. And that was because she was on the back of a Jeep and was driving into Green Square in Tripoli as Gaddafi was fleeing and the troops were setting aside. And we were the only people to do that because of obviously bravery, but also because we had a small satellite dish and we plugged it into the cigarette lighter of the Jeep. There was no satellite truck, and that was really a kind of a classic example of how innovation had changed and enabled us to get to a story which we wouldn't have been able to get to before. And in that instance, we were the only broadcasters in the world to be telling that story. And that kind of brings us on a bit to the importance of distinct journalism, of having something which is different from the others. And every day when I'm planning for tomorrow for Sunrise, I'll get all the embargoed stories that come in. There'll be the MP's report, there'll be the story about cancer rates, there'll be something funny, and they all come in and everybody gets them. And tomorrow morning, you can pretty much guess which page they're going to be on the Daily Mail, in the Telegraph. But actually, and of course we do these stories when they're on merit. But for us, it makes much more sense for us to invest in our own journalism, because that's what will set us apart, and that's what will bring customers to us. Because actually, all those stories, all those reports, if you Google, I want to know about the report by the MPs today, will come up on all those different news services, and you can read them 10 times over, and they probably have a slightly different spin on the top line depending which newspaper they're written for. But actually, there's nothing which is unique in that. Whereas if we've got our own story, then that's unique. You know, that gives us something which we can say, we told you, and we can set the pace with those stories. And that's where a lot of our effort now is being placed, and that's why there's been a real focus on bringing in specialist journalists, classically people who are hacks, frankly, in newspapers, like Mark Kleiman and Ed Conway, Paul Kelso. And they've converted to TV, and you know what, when they first started, I'm sure they'll all admit, you know, they weren't the greatest TV performers. And in the past, you would have recruited journalists who were great TV performers and could write really well and would create a beautiful package for you. But actually, did they bring in the news stories which make your journalism distinct? And that's where the effort needs to be. And you've seen that, again, I'll give you some more examples in recent days on the Grenfell Tower story. And I think in the past, Sky News would have, you know, thrown everybody at that story, quite rightly, and you would have correspondents at multiple locations, be up at multiple times, and they'd just be stood there doing live after live after live after live after live after live all day long. And there's still a role for that, but actually it makes much more sense, instead of having 3 people out doing that, to have 1 person who does that all day, and have your other 2 journalists off digging away, trying to find the story which will make news and will give you your own top line. And by doing that, we were able to expose the story about the insulation boards giving off hydrogen cyanide, story about the government being warned in 2016 about fire risk from the cladding. And those are the sort of stories which maybe in the past the newspapers would have splashed on, and then we'd have followed up. And maybe the day after, we'd have been stood there talking all about cyanide. But actually, we're the one who are then leading, and then the newspapers are following us, as happened with that example. And that sort of goes really across the board, really. It's about making sure that, you know, we're creating stories which newspapers are kind of following us on. And that brings us to my next point about, you know, where or how we're producing the stories now. And in the past, and you know, I've spoken quite a lot here about TV, but actually, just as important in the commissioning of what we do now and what I do now is for mobile and for social as well. My role, I was an executive producer on Sunrise and on other programs, and I was executive producer for TV. So my job was just to look after the TV program. But now I'm output editor, and I'm in charge of output across all platforms. So I'm just as responsible for what goes on the TV as I am for what goes on the mobile and what goes on the website, and oversight for social as well. And when I'm commissioning for the next day, when I'm thinking how we're going to cover this story, I'm not just thinking who's going to make that TV piece. I'm also thinking, well, who's going to write the news lead, where we're going to get the analysis from. Because actually, if you go onto your phone, again, you can have a click onto, you know, when you wake up in the morning and you click onto your Sky News app, which I know is the first thing you all do, you will see all the stories there. And then if you click on the Beeb, you'll see all the same stories. And then you click on the Guardian, you see all the same stories, because they all get covered. What will make them different will be the pieces of analysis which come from our experts. And that's where a lot of our investment in online journalism is going as well. And equally with that, and this is going to grow as well, is mobile video. And you might have the most, you know, brilliantly, beautifully scripted, wonderful news piece for the morning, which would go on TV. And you could stick that on your phone. But you know what? Nobody's going to watch it. Are they going to sit on the tube with their phone turned up? It's not going to happen. But what they will do is consume it if it's packaged correctly. So what we're having to do now, and we've got a whole unit which just works on mobile videos, is producing them in a way that you can watch them without volume on. And that's important for us, and important for you as well if you're thinking about, you know, when you're going to try and pitch out stories. And then there's obviously, you've got social media, which changes the way it's packaged again. package durations for that material is different. And then Snapchat, which who'd have thought Sky News would be on Snapchat 3-4 years ago, but it's actually one of our most successful platforms now. And so that kind of brings me really up to kind of today and what we're doing now and the kind of the news environment which we're in at the moment. And there's no denying that the past few weeks and the past year have really been one of which will stand out in history, from the Brexit vote, which incredibly was only just over a year ago, but feels so much longer than that, through to Trump, and then everything that's happened since. And one thing which we've had to learn from those stories is the importance of listening to our audience and the people who will actually instigate those remarkable stories. And again, that's how we've had to adapt our journalism. We're doing a lot more long-form analytical documentaries now. We'll be commissioned to make stuff for Sky Atlantic, for example, and did a series of documentaries around the US election for that. And again, it's about making sure that we've got visual storytelling of those stories on our apps as well, so as they give the kind of analysis and context to it all. But at the same time, it's not forgetting about having some balls and taking a risk and having a go at stories and things like whenever the height of the Sir Philip Green scandal, we sent one of our reporters, David Bowden, who's a classic journalist who will get in your face, and he went over to the Greek island where we understood that his yacht was. We phoned up to try and get an interview with him. It wasn't going to happen. So we thought, well, we'll take a punt. We'll go over there and we'll see if we see him. And if we see him, then we'll front him up and we'll ask him why he's not addressing the pension scandal. And got a very, very engaging moment of TV where David and the cameraman got pushed over. And actually, it's, again, in terms of pictures, so I keep coming back to pictures, that really did speak volumes. And it's one of those images which will be used on Sky News for eons whenever we talk about Sir Philip Green. And that sort of really does bring me to kind of the close, really. It's just important to remember that, if you are out there and you're thinking, I want to get a story onto Sky News, or think about what you're trying to put on. Don't just think Sky News. Are you wanting something that's going to appear on TV? Are you wanting something that's going to appear on mobile? Think about the audience and think about how is that going to be distinct, because what I or Sky News don't want to hear is something which everybody else is going to have, because there's nothing defining in that. And hand over to Martin.
I think I've got a special job, a fantastic job, and the more I tell you about it, the more you will want my job. In fact, my job just now is to find successors to not just me, but to my deputy and to our features people, and even Philip and Holly, who are our main presenters, along with Eamon and Ruth, on this morning. And what I'm looking for just now is just a bit of tape to show what the essence of this morning, which is about connecting with the viewer. It's, as Tim and Ronan have said, we think a lot about who's available to view, who's out there at our time of day, 10:30 to 12:25 in the morning. There's all sorts of people out there. My average viewer is a 53-year-old housewife. But on both sides of that, historically from this morning, it's been a big student audience and there's a big older audience on either side of that housewife as well. And at the end of the day, I have to get as many people to watch, otherwise my mortgage doesn't get paid. I'd love to do news all day long. I can't afford to do it because they won't watch it at that time of day. That's not what they're there for. They're for companionship, and that's what we're there to give them. An example of how special my job is, I came straight from a meeting where we're moving, I think, probably the most complicated, biggest studio move that's been done in many, many years here. So ITV is on the South Bank, about a mile from here, and a big tower and studio complex around it, and this morning has its own purpose-built studio on the river. And that's that fabulous view that you see. That's been sold. The tower is probably going to be sold to residential, so Russian oligarchs, or those who've got £60 million a floor for a flat, can buy 22 floors of it. And the rest of it is being redeveloped, knocked down, and sort of rebuilt back as our studios and office space. And so for 4 years probably, our 4 daytime shows, so This Morning, Loose Women, Lorraine and Good Morning Britain will be going to what are now the BBC newly refurbished studios at White City. So we're taking 2 big studios there. Our sets will share studios, so studios 2 and 3 will have Loose Women, and I think it's 3 will have Loose Women and Lorraine, and 2, which is bigger, will have Good Morning Britain. And This Morning our sets will be in place. For the past few months we've been recording the seasons outside our window on the South Bank, so that we will run. So when you watch us, when we go on air, probably in about 6-7 months' time, you'll probably still see the same kind of look. We're not going to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. So we've been recording what it looks like outside as the seasons change. That will still be a big part of our set. This Morning is all about water. You haven't got our graphics here, but when you look at This Morning graphics, even the ones, and they're about 18 months old now, they have almost like the waves, rippling waves through them with a nice taupe color. And that's taken from the Albert Dock 30 years ago. Next year it'll be 30 years that This Morning started. So it was Albert Dock, dockside water. This Morning it's Thames side. We have big Hollywood names come in to see us quite often, and they're astonished it's not CGI. They cannot believe that those windows actually look out onto a real scene. It is, and we've probably all been, certainly in the TV business, to Rockefeller, where NBC's based, and they've got that fabulous sort of set out there and people all around them. Great location. I don't think there's a better location for a live television studio than where we are just now. It's an astonishing view. And every day, you know, I go in the gallery for those 2 hours, and I can just watch. I'd be happy for my presenters to read the phone book, quite frankly, because I love the boats going past. You can almost sort of, if you don't care what's going on telly, you can almost sort of lull yourself into a false sense of security that the world is still going on out there, especially with what we've been through in the past 6 to 8 weeks. It's just nice to know that there's sort of a uniformity, it still is dependable, and it's there, and it's about trust more than anything, so we're still on there. So why is it a special job? Because, well, I'm in charge of all of it, basically. It's like an editor. The Americans would call it an executive producer, but for us it's an editor. For our 4 live shows, we are in charge of them. Like a newspaper editor, we decide who presents it, what content's in there. Even with our sales and commercial people, I have a really close relationship with them too, in terms of, we're currently looking for a new sponsor for This Morning. Boots ends, I think it's about 5 years of association with us come October. So we've gone to market this week actually with This Morning as a proposition. So if you get a few £1 million in your back pocket, or you have clients who might want to sort of take part of This Morning, be associated with us, then please let me know, and we might be able to do some sort of deal on that, I thought. So in the past, journalists, of which I am one, would have a suspicion, a healthy suspicion of sales and even PR. I think that has gone now. Certainly with sales, we realize that we have to work very closely with them, because that's in the commercial sector, that's the way, you know, we get paid, and there's a big respect for that. It's tough out there, and so everyone's looking at different ways of making money. We run competitions. We make no bones about that. We've had issues in the past with competitions, but everything is absolutely back on track now. And I'm responsible for the look of those competitions too. So not only our content, who presents it, but the competitions. I have a chat with sales sometimes about, you know, what they're doing in sponsorship. I'm responsible for the look of This Morning, so the set. 18 months ago we sat down, we put a new set in there, we opened up the windows. The old This Morning set actually had, we've 5 big windows on the Thames. 3 of them were boarded up, and it was a fake brick kind of set. So we just stripped all that back, and it's now sort of an aspirational. And we're taking the view that, do you know what? For many, many years, I worked at GMTV as the editor there, and we had quite literally, well, it was a painted cloth behind us, because we didn't want to upset anybody north of Watford who couldn't get to London in a day, thinking that, oh gosh, that's you having a great life down there, you metropolitan elite. And so we just almost denied the fact that we were in London. Now, of course, that's just crazy, because everything is so accessible. Most people have been to or will come to London. And also, it's a great city. Why not say and be loud and proud, we're here, and that's what we do. And why is my job also special? Well, I get to work with, I think, the best live presenters in television. They're big, big names. Philip Schofield and Holly Willoughby, Monday to Thursday. Eamon Holmes and Ruth Langsford on Friday. Then you add in our contributors, Rylan, who's just something else, but a great fun. Alison Hammond, who's just a bundle of energy. I've got 4 doctors pretty much on staff. I also have, I think, probably the world's only full-time counsellor that we employ who is there Monday to Friday, 9 till 5. And she will clearly deal with people who are phoning up with our phone-ins, again, which happen every day. The phone-in this morning is the bedrock of it. It's there every single day. And she will take care of people who haven't got the right answers or enough answer that they want from the phone-in. She'll be on the phone with them afterwards. And she will also follow up lots of things that you never get to hear about here, that we never broadcast. We just do that because that's part of our pastoral kind of care. And the fact that this morning is a real family. It's not just a family ourselves, because we're very close, we're all good friends, but also with the viewers. I think there's that kind of connection. That's what we try to make it, the companion, as I keep coming back to, or that sort of synergy, a real sort of trust that you know what you're going to get. And so on those awful mornings and awful days when we've had terrorist attacks or those awful, the awful Grenfell Tower fire, it's good for people to wake up, to switch on once they've seen some news and see that at least Philip and Holly are still there. They will cover it in their own way, but the world is still going on, and they're there and they're giving their views on it, and people actually quite like to hear what they have to say. They're turning up in their numbers as well. This morning is a brand in itself, so when brands come to us saying, can we be part, can we put our brands onto your show, and of course we have Ofcom regulations that make that quite difficult, but there are ways through. We have to remember that This Morning itself is a massive brand. It's actually bigger than some brands that come to us to go on telly. It's an older brand than most of them as well, 30 years on, and it's still relevant. It's still putting on ratings. Just this year, all 4 ITV daytime shows are up year on year. Last year, This Morning was up year on year from the year before that. So any talk of managing decline of television audiences going down is nonsense. Certainly, we've found a formula, and it's quite simple. Just give them what people want. Just really, really understand who your audience is. So they want a laugh in the morning as well. And the great thing is, again, my job is so special. I can stand at the back of my gallery with our producers and our whole team, and I just really enjoy what we do. And so much of it is a laugh, and the stuff you don't get to see on television. So when our advertising breaks, or when there's a longer competition on. Sorry, I can't tell you this because we're probably broadcasting this out on social media just now, but there are fantastic moments, believe me. Some of it gets to YouTube. The biggest one so far is like 20.5 million views. There's another one I'm going to show you now, hopefully it'll work, which is only 2.5 million views, but again, it's only a week or two old. And yes, I'll be honest, they are about people giggling. That's what it is. It's about 2 presenters having a great time, but knowing the envelope in which they can work and being professional enough to know that although they can corpse, within the whole kind of, I suppose, ethos, and what I hope bring to them is the confidence and the comfort of the show. They're allowed to do that and still pick up and get on with other things. As I said, it's 30 years next October that This Morning started. And in going to market with a sponsorship thing, we're even saying to them, if you want to come to us, we'll happily do workshops for you to show you how a brand can be relevant and still survive in this modern age. So they all say we're going to die. We're old-fashioned steam television, and I've been around for a long, long time. Started in newspapers, then local radio, then national papers. I was at Sky News before Ronan was born. All those kind of things. I was there the night the Berlin Wall came down in Berlin. I was on Tiananmen Square when the man stood in front of the tanks. So I've been around, so I'm a hard news journalist, but at the end of the day, I'm a journalist first and foremost, and I like to think I know what the viewer wants. So we have this general kind of feeling at This Morning that if we can get in as many people like us who either have stories or are advertisers, then we keep that within the family. The way that stories come in these days, social media has a massive play. It used to be, and I never really watched This Morning until I went there 18 months ago. It used to be they had a thing called The Hub, which was almost like you had sort of presenters who were kind of not full-time presenters, but they wanted to be on telly, so they'd give them this job in a spare bit of the studio, which was boarded up so you couldn't see the Thames, but it was called The Hub, and this is where people would phone in, or they would actually contact them on social media kind of thing. It was like, wow, look, they come up on a screen and that's their name and all this sort of stuff, and isn't this amazing sort of stuff? And we did away with all that because, of course, social media is just part of everything we do. And the biggest buzz for a lot of viewers is actually sending things, whether it's to the show or to Philip and Holly. Between the two of them on Twitter, they have 13 million followers. The show itself has 1.75 million on Facebook and probably the similar on Twitter. So it's big numbers for just one show. The biggest thing for a lot of viewers is actually when it comes onto Philip's phone, whether it's on his Snapchat or his direct Twitter feed, and he just shows it up to camera. So we're almost going back to basics, but social media is such an important part of what we do. It drives everything that we do. I have a small team, it's probably only sort of 3 or 4 who work on social media with us, but they drive relentlessly. Facebook is a great source of stories for us as well. We engage with our viewers on that too. We'd be disappointed if we don't get at least 1,000 comments a day on the stories that we do. On just some stories, we will get 2,000 or 3,000 comments. You always know the ones that are going to take off. So we look at that, we monitor it. And funnily enough, the busiest time for this morning's Facebook and for this morning's YouTube channel are usually about 8 o'clock at night. So although this is a program that primarily goes out during the day, This Morning lives now, as we all have to do, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, worldwide. We get a lot of audience when America wakes up, when Australia wakes up too. So English-speaking audience will actually sort of log in and watch what we're doing, which is a fabulous thing for us. We take that as all part of the brand itself. So it's not just This Morning on telly, but we're the brand guardians of what you see. So Birmingham, 25,000 people in May through the doors of This Morning Live, which was 4 days at the NEC, just with This Morning viewers coming to see what we did. It was kind of an ideal home show exhibition, but we had a stage there with all our presenters and lots of stalls, lots of suppliers, lots of advertisers, and again, connecting with the audience. And that was a great source for me to be there to listen to them, although I tend to think I like to know what they are thinking, but just great to hear it from them again, just reinforcing what we do. Another reason it's special was just, coming here, apart from talking about moving to the White City, we've just been talking about what we're doing on Thursday this week, which is This Morning's live wedding. So we're taking a couple, deserving couple, and we're going to marry them at the top of the Shard. So we've sorted that out. We are trying to get a helicopter to fly past with a banner below, but we can't do that because it'll catch in the rotors and crash. That'll be another story. So there'll be a plane going past. That's been sorted. Millie Dowler, again, this shows you the kind of strange world I live in that we have to just get your heads around, which makes This Morning, I think, the most traditional and genuine daytime magazine show of all. I think Ronan's probably, as he said, a lot with rolling news, and Tim will be dealing with a kind of a panel show with a big name guest. We are, I think, by far the most genuine magazine show. We are sort of a strange concoction of pretty much everything that we do. So yeah, sure, there's a wedding on Thursday, but also Millie Dowler, who died 15 years ago, her sister, her big sister, has just written a book, and I read it. It's a very, very, very moving book, and she's talking for the first time about her little sister, what it meant to the family, when she went missing, then her body was found, and of course, what it meant to be phone hacked, and telling David Cameron to man up in Downing Street, sitting in a room with Rupert Murdoch, where he's actually in tears at what Gemma Dowler and her parents were telling him as to what his business had done. So that's very, very sort of hard news compared to the other things I'm doing. And then there's another story tomorrow we're doing about a wee boy who wanted a panda from Asda, and he couldn't afford it, and then the staff clubbed in and they're giving him the panda. So you try and take all this in, and then you go home, and that's why I drink lots of wine, because it's the only way to get it out and to actually sort of make some sense of it all. But it feels special. So in summation, all of it is strangely workable. I never quite know why it all works. Probably because I enjoy watching it myself, and that's not a bad yardstick. If you can make something that you enjoy making and watching, it doesn't matter what time of day it goes. This daytime sort of pejorative attitude of people who have a sort of pejorative attitude towards daytime for many, many years. It's like sort of the wasteland. The shows that we make, all of us make in daytime, are absolutely first-class shows. I think only America and Australia probably can match us in terms of our production values, the editorial input, and certainly the journalism is better than any country I know. We all have different agendas, different audiences. We kind of live in harmony. We probably try and pinch a percentage here, a percentage there from other shows. But so far, it works. And I'll tell you the last thing is, and this is probably going out to everyone, so maybe someone at ITV will get this now and it'll all change. But the other reason it's special, and I've been there probably for 17 years now, firstly at GMTV, and then as editor of Loose Women, and then coming back to do This Morning quite recently. When you drive up ITV, it's this big building that's almost gone, and there's big metal gates down into the car park, and you're very lucky if you've got a car parking space there. There's not many, but it's got car recognition plate number, and that sort of number thing. There's the camera there, it sees your registration number, and it just like sort of by magic, Alibaba, it opens kind of stuff. And I live in fear that one day when I turn up, it'll just be, well, the red light won't change to green. And so far, touch wood, it does that. And so I just know when the red light's on, as opposed to being live, for me that means, my time's up. As will come, and I'll be off, off to Chianti drinking wine. Thank you.